Welcome back as we continue our study into the Gospel of John, and today we are looking at John chapter 4 verses 1 to 6, which I have titled, The Setting. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. We see how clearly these verses relate to the earlier verse in chapter 3 verses 25 to 26. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification, and they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to him. We read John's disciples were concerned because Jesus was also baptizing and everyone was going after him. In John chapter 4 verse 1 we are told, the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. Perhaps the unnamed Jew who was arguing with the disciples of John in chapter 3 verse 25 relayed information about Jesus' baptizing ministry to the Pharisees. The evangelist explains that although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, why he felt it necessary to add this explanation is not clear. Perhaps it was to counter unhealthy pride on the part of his readers based on their association with those who had been baptized by Jesus himself. The matter of who was baptizing by whom was one of the causes of unhealthy preferences for one leader instead of another in the Corinthian church. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 11 to 16, For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. In verse 3, we see the news that the Pharisees had heard this prompted action on Jesus' part. He left Judea and departed again to Galilee. The evangelist does not explain why this news led Jesus to leave Judea. Perhaps he did not wish to be in competition with John, whose ministry he endorsed, or his increasingly high profile meant it was necessary for him to avoid premature confrontation with the Pharisees. In verse 4, we see describing Jesus' return to Galilee, and the evangelist says, and he had to pass through Samaria. There are 3 routes between Jerusalem and Galilee. Only one passed through Samaria. The others bypassed it. One route was along the Jordan Valley, bypassing Samaria to the east, and the other involved cutting across the Mediterranean Sea coast and bypassing Samaria to the west. The route Jesus took was the Central Ridge Road, passing through the middle of the land and thus through Samaria. The normal route taken by Jews traveling between Galilee and Jerusalem was through Samaria. Josephus, in his recorded works, writes, Samaria was now under Roman rule, and for rapid travel it was essential to take that route, by which Jerusalem may be reached in 3 days from Galilee. And it was custom at that time of a festival to pass through Samaritan territory on their way to the holy city. Jesus then had to pass through Samaria because it was the shortest and normal way people traveled between Jerusalem and Galilee. However, in the light of the narrative that follows, which is the conversation with the Samaritan woman and the Samaritan townspeople coming to believe in Jesus, Jesus' need to go through Samaria may have been determined by divine will as well as geographical factors. In verse 5, we see that on Jesus' way to Galilee, he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Sychar, usually identified with the present-day Sychar, is located about a mile southeast of the present-day Nablus, and very close to the site of ancient Sychar, which is located at the entrance of the valley separating the two mountains, Gerizim and Ebal. Jacob bequeathed a piece of land near here to his son Joseph, and it was in this land that Joseph's bones were laid to rest when the Israelites came out of Egypt, as written in Genesis chapter 33, verse 19, and Joshua chapter 24, verse 32. In verse 6, the evangelist provides two final pieces of the information to set the scene. First, he says Jacob's well was there. There is no mention in the Old Testament of Jacob digging such a well, but it does indicate that he owned land in this area. However, to this day, there is a deep well at this place. As one scholar describes this, the well of Jacob, which is still to be seen today in the same place where it was shown to earlier pilgrims, is undoubtedly genuine, though it is not mentioned in the Old Testament. It is a fine installation with a cylindrical shaft 7 feet in diameter and 106 feet deep, driven into the rock and fresh subsoil water at the bottom, like Isaac's well, written in Genesis chapter 26, verse 19, ringed by a wall on top. There are 2 holes through which a bucket can be lowered, and the water lies near the bottom of the shaft. The second point the evangelist adds is, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. If Jesus had been baptizing in the same area as John and had left from there heading northwest to Sychar, he had covered a significant distance. As the crow flies, Sychar is about 30 miles from Ainon, but following the Roman roads it was about 40 miles. The journey would take a day and a half, so Jesus and his disciples would arrive in Sychar on the 2nd day at about the 6th hour, which is about noon. Tired from his journey, Jesus sat down by the well and rested. With any great literature, any author would describe the events leading up to the critical point. Here we see God-inspired word through the author of John, laying out the precursor for the events to follow, which be the discourse between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. My brothers and sisters, as we read Scripture, we sometimes forget that God does not leave out inspired details that are crucial to His unfolding narrative. As disciplined individuals, we must always see that narrative as relevant to God's inspired message to us. I myself have allowed myself to be immersed in the narrative as an observer to the unfolding story, which allows me the opportunity to see clearly the events unfolding. As we read Scripture, always be reminded that God does not leave out details which are relevant to our knowledge, to inspire our hearts to be the witness to His unfolding story. Thank you, and God bless.